Marilyne Ordekian here to give us a talk. And just want to remind you that this webinar is being recorded. And so just give a bit of intro about our speaker today. So Marilyne is a final year PhD student candidate at the University College of London. UCL's Center for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity, and is also a lawyer. And her interdisciplinary research, funded by the EPSRC, spans two key themes at the intersection of law, cybersecurity, and technology. So the first focus is it's on cryptocurrency ecosystem, where she develops methods to empirically quantify regulations and measure platform compliance. She also empirically investigates emerging cryptocurrency crimes with pioneering research on wrench attacks and big butchering scams. And her second theme explores the application of AI in law, examining the emerging privacy and security issues that arise from its use. And based on her research, Marilyne advises law enforcement agencies such as the Metropolitan Police. So we're delighted to have her today, and the title of her talk today is investigating wrench attacks, physical attacks targeting cryptocurrency users. So Marilyne will speak for about 30 minutes, and during her talk, if you have a quick question, you may raise your hand and we will then unmute you to ask the question. But before you ask the question, please do identify yourself, let us know who you are and your institution and affiliation. You can ask questions during her talk to make it more interactive, or you can ask questions at the end. So we will also have a Q&A session at the end. Alternatively, you can also ask questions, put your questions in the chat, and we will also monitor the chat area. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Marilyne, please.
Thank you, Joseph, for the introduction and for inviting me. And I'm happy to be kickstarting the Center Seminar Series for this year. Let me first start by sharing my screen and we could begin the talk. Okay, can you confirm if you could see my screen and the slides?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. So first of all, I would like to shout out my co-authors, Gilberto and Professor Alice Hutchings and Dr. Marie Vazek, and also the Cambridge Cybercrime Center. And now today I am going to talk to you, as Joseph mentioned, about cryptocurrency wrench attacks. And I'm hoping at least some of you have heard of these attacks. Otherwise, don't worry, I will walk you through them through this presentation. So our paper was published about a year ago in last September. And after a few months, wrench attacks surge in their occurrence, with major incidents continuously occurring to this date. So here are just a few examples. Like one of the incidents is the famous hardware wallet company, Ledger, and the CEO was kidnapped and faced some physical assault in exchange of giving out some of his cryptocurrencies. And another very recent incident includes a duo in Glasgow. This was last week or 2 weeks ago. And they are standing trial for allegedly plotting to rob multiple houses known to be occupied by wealthy cryptocurrency people. So this unfortunate sudden surge in attack gave our paper a very big exposure. So we currently have surpassed 22K downloads for the paper. I mean, of course, as academics, we are happy when our papers get this exposure, but unfortunately, it's for unfortunate and sad incidents such as these. We have also, as Joseph mentioned, that we have been in talks with the Met Police about this, and we have provided recommendations to fight or curb the occurrence of these attacks. Fingers crossed, they will not continue to surge in their occurrence. But this exploded interest started way after we conducted our study. So why did we investigate this issue to begin with when they weren't that popular? So to take you back a few years, and I come from a small country in the Middle East called Lebanon. And for those who don't know, in the past 6 years, Lebanon has faced one of the worst economic crises in the 21st century. This led many people to resort to cryptocurrencies as an alternative to the failed banking system. But around 2-3 years ago, this was around May or June 2022, a member of the cryptocurrency community escaped death after being attacked by an armed gang which ran off with their funds. This was more than 100K, and they were transacting in person. So this brings me to our motivation for this paper. Now, as an academic, the first thing I did 3 years ago, once I heard about this incident, was to go to Google Scholar and to find out more about these attacks, how they work, and how we can protect against them. But to my utter surprise, I could not find anything. So I did some Google search, and it turns out that these attacks weren't anything new. In fact, they were happening since the early days of Bitcoin. So, for instance, even the famous cyberpunk Hal Finney, who is the first person to transact in Bitcoin, has been once a victim of these attacks. So this brings me to how we started this project. So we decided to investigate through an interdisciplinary lens and conduct analyses on 3 different data sets. But first, you must be wondering, what is this cryptocurrency range attack she's been talking about for a few minutes now? So the terminology itself comes from this XKCD comic on the right, coined back in 2009. So it basically shows that one character suggests to hit the owner of the laptop with a wrench to give out the password instead of hacking into the laptop, which might be considered a much more complicated and technically sophisticated method to get into the laptop. So from here, we wanted to understand the definition of this attack. So as you could know, in order for us to conduct any type of criminal analysis or in legal analysis or in criminal law, you need to have a formal definition of a certain attack. But we didn't have any. And in order for us to identify the crime elements and determine the scope of the attacks, we had to do this ourselves. So I'm not going to go too much into detail here about what we did and the step-by-step process. There's more in the paper if you're interested. But to give a summary of it, to create the definition, I came up with a methodology that analyzed English and French criminal laws and proposed a definition and crime elements that suit the properties specific to this attack. That is, they are unique to these attacks. So the definition, as you can see in the slide, is basically the following. Physical attacks physical targetings of cryptocurrency owners with the intention to gain unlawful possession and ownership of their cryptocurrencies by means of physical force or threat of force or harm. Now, this is a table from the paper itself, where we outline the mens rea element and the actus reus, like the act, the result, and the causation between both the act and the result, which are requirements under criminal laws and constitute the crime elements. And since we were targeting a technical audience too in this paper, we had to translate the legalese for a non-legal audience to maximize the outreach. As you could see here in this column, where we provide a loose understanding of what the property is, what belonging to another is, and such. And one important question to ask here is, so what's so special and unique about cryptocurrency wrench attacks? And how are they different from other cryptocurrency crime? So we first identified that the crime scene in wrench attacks is the real physical world, while in almost or all other cryptocurrency crimes, everything is online or digital, like online fraud or hacking or your wallet being breached into and such. When we come to the crime methods of committing a wrench attack, as we see, and we will see in this presentation later on, they are mostly conventional tools and methods borrowed from conventional and classical physical crime, while in other cryptocurrency crimes, they are mostly sophisticated and technical methodologies that require high levels of security, skills, and such. Third, when it comes to the target and the aim in wrench attacks, it's persons and their property. That is, it could be me and my funds. But in other crimes, it's usually mostly the funds. That is, the person will not be directly targeted in any way. Fourth, existing security measures are unfortunately not sufficient to protect against wrench attacks, while against other cryptocurrency crimes, they're mostly sufficient, not perfect, but they could curb the occurrence of some of them. And finally, when it comes to victims, in wrench attacks, almost everyone is a victim, can be a victim here, while in other cryptocurrency crimes, based on other literature and research done on the community, they're mostly newer and non-tech savvy users who are unfortunately more prone to be victimized. Now that we have defined what a wrench attack is, we move on to how we investigated these attacks. So the cryptocurrency community is hard to reach in general when it comes to behavioral research. This is evident in several of studies, some of them are mentioned here, which were conducted with users. It was very difficult to convince users to participate. Now, imagine how even more difficult it was for us and more challenging to reach out and obtain data from cryptocurrency users who were victims. To overcome this challenge, we implemented something called data triangulation, where we used 3 different data sets, generated and used 3 different data sets in order to overcome the biases that exist in one data set. So for instance, first of all, we used the Cambridge Cybercrime Crime BB data set. And in that data set, they have crawled more than 45 million posts from the famous and popular Bitcoin Talk online forum. And from there, we identified 672 possible wrench attack related posts. Later, we interviewed 10 victims and experts in the field. And from there, we identified 11 reported incidents. When I say reported, that is reported to us, not necessarily to the police. And finally, we also collected and analyzed 147 news articles that were reporting wrench attacks. So overall, we end up including 119 wrench attack incidents in this study. And the earliest recorded incident in our data set goes back to 2011. Okay, so in order for us to analyze all this data after performing data triangulation, we performed something called a crime script analysis, which is a popular criminological method and is considered a powerful technique particularly useful for understanding complex crime types. And crime script analysis was first proposed in 1994 by Cornish, and it involves basically breaking down the different steps and stages involved in carrying out a crime, as it allows for the examination of script variations. That is, the different ways an individual may execute a certain action within the overall framework. And this method is very important, as not only it outlines the sequence of events, but also identifies the various actors that are involved. Moreover, this breakdown helps pinpoint different ways to intervene and disrupt each individual sequence and script, which offers concrete avenues for prevention for law enforcement, for industry partners, and for individuals even. And conceptually, crime script analysis borrows from behavioral and cognitive sciences idea, which is called schemata. So this idea basically outlines that we have established mental processes that allow us to act consistently in familiar situations without having to relearn every new context. And here I'm going to use an example that my colleague and co-author, Professor Alice Hutchings, usually and often used to explain this idea. So as she explains, so consider us today present in this seminar series, right? So we can consider that we have a schema for a seminar. So each week or month, Joseph and the team invite a person that comes and presents. We have a person who presents, we have the audience, which is you who are listening, and we have questions that are asked. While there are variations to this, like sometimes it can be online, sometimes it can be hybrid or just in person, the overall process is basically the same. And this framework of repeated and structured process is used to understand crimes and criminal behavior, which usually follow a repeated structure of process. And now we move on into how wrench attacks work. So first, we have identified, based on our crime script analysis, 5 groups of, let me just move this here, 5 groups of complicits. So we first have OTC brokers or peer-to-peer transactors, which are basically the people who meet in person to buy or sell cryptocurrencies. We then obviously have organized crime groups. We had certain situations where unfortunately we had friends or family or work colleagues who were the attackers. In a couple of very unique cases, we had the victims who turned out to be later as offenders. For example, we had a couple of situations where the attackers were previously victimized by their wrench attack victim. That is, for instance, let me take the example of me and Joseph. For example, Joseph wanted to come to me and I convinced him to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars into this new coin. And it turned out to be a scam. I scammed him. And then because he lost all of his savings or such, he comes as a revenge, commits wrench attack against me. So he was the victim in the beginning, but he turned out to be the offender in the later stage. And finally, in few instances, we have corrupt law enforcement agents who, by different ways, identified that certain people had cryptocurrencies and they detained them or blackmailed them with or committed legal extortion against them. For instance, they threatened them to fabricate fake crimes and pin them on them in order to threaten them to give out some cryptocurrencies.
Marilyne,
Yes.
It sounds really worrying. You know, you use me as an example as a victim, but I just want to know, what, I'm an academic, and then
Yeah.
I often post things on social media platforms like LinkedIn about crypto.
Yes.
Am I a risk of being attacked? What kind of people that do wrench attackers target? I mean, yeah, I just want to measure the, the level of risk that I have, as an academic. And what kind of people do they target specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm gonna explain that now, but let me just clarify that it's not a case where I want to, frighten everyone or, frighten you specifically. We cannot predict who can be attacked or who can be or foresee who can be a potential target, because as we will see and as I had explained, there usually no differentiation between the people who are being targeted. So so yeah, I don't want to scare you, but as you consider like any type of crime, there's always a possibility for anyone to be any type of victim, right? So I don't know, like if today someone will come and rob my flat, right? So yes, basically that's it. Let me try to provide a more comprehensive understanding of the people who can be attacked based around data set. So just a moment. So before that, let me just say that based on our data, mostly the attackers were groups and total strangers to their victims, with the exception of the category colleagues, friends, and family. Now, to hopefully answer your question, in terms of who the victims are, we have regular cryptocurrency users. That is basically anyone who owns cryptocurrencies, even if you're not crypto rich or one of the, very wealthy people who are maybe perhaps early adopters. We have experts, be it industry or academia, like yourself, or myself. And we have cryptocurrency miners, and we have also famous people in the space like influencers, YouTubers. We have seen multiple cases of YouTubers being attacked, and also people who are famous for their contributions, like famous developers or CEOs of companies. And finally, we have again family, friends, and colleagues. And to move on in terms of to the geographical location and distribution of the occurrences of these attacks, we have incidents reported in 6 continents, excluding Antarctica, of course. And the most occurred incidents equally almost occurred in Europe and Asia. And in terms of the when, we have the earliest reported attacks back in 2011 and most reported in 2017-18, which, if you remember, this was when the ICO boom, occurred back at the end of 2017, and also in 2021 when Bitcoin at the time reached an all-new time high, which was 64K, I think. But also to mention that our paper was published last year, so our data set does not include the incidents in this past year, which we can all agree that everything, their occurrence surpassed the number of previous years. And if you are wondering into why would they do this, considering the risks of this, well, obviously for financial gain, but some might argue that breaking into someone's house or just, holding a gun to their heads in an alley on the street is easier than orchestrating a cyber attack and hacking into their wallet or into a service provider's servers. And finally, as you know, in compliance with anti-money laundering policies, a lot of exchanges are putting a limit into the daily transfer amounts of cryptocurrencies. So when you're stealing cryptocurrencies in person and physically, basically there is no limit. You don't have to go through the compliance and the KYC and everything, which makes it a bit more convenient if you're stealing hundreds and millions. Okay, so we have identified 7 forms of conventional crimes as range attacks. So first we have kidnapping, where a person is relocated to a different location against their consent. And we have forcible confinement, where in this case, the person is locked in the same place against their consent. So in this case, I could recall an incident where a few corrupt law enforcement agents came into the flat of a cryptocurrency owner, and they prevented them from leaving the house until they gave out some cryptocurrencies. So in this case, we consider that forcible confinement. The second category, or the third type, is burglary, where a person's house is broken into. So you have trespassing and stealing. And this was arguably or evidently the most occurred type of wrench attack recorded in our data set. And then obviously we have robberies or street muggings. The third category we have is murder, unfortunately, and then we have blackmail or verbal abuse, which also included legal extortion, as I mentioned earlier in another example. And finally, we have identified cases occurring within domestic ecosystems in this case, and we penned a new terminology called cryptocurrency facilitated domestic economic abuse. So in this case, we will have an intimate partner, for instance, or a family member who was economically abusing the victim and preventing them from, or basically, let me just remember another example. Basically forcing them to give out their savings, which were in Bitcoin, for instance, or spiking them and taking their belongings from their wallet without their consent. And based on our findings, 20% of the incidents occurred during peer-to-peer transactions. Basically, 25% of the attacks that we have occurred when people were meeting actually in person, be it during Bitcoin meetups or Bitcoin gatherings, or just transacting in person. And when it comes to the tools that they were using, now, these were mostly conventional tools, which I will review in a bit, but there were some very unconventional and a bit weird tools which might show that the attackers can be very inexperienced people as well. Like in this case, for instance, this guy just entered and broke into this woman's house, and the only tool and weapon he had was a very large, customized with his name on it, a Toblerone bar, and he hit her on the head to steal 1.2 million Bitcoins. So this is a very unconventional case, but usually the tools were very basic ones. Let's go over them now. So we identified 6 common categories of tools or methods. The most common one was physical violence. This is any form of physical violence. Second, we have firearms. Then we have offensive weapons like big knives. Then we had spiking, legal extortion, swatting, and in few cases, they were just a bit, sorry, unspecified. So as you could see, and as expected, in burglary and kidnapping and robbery, the most common methods were physical violence and firearm, which aligns with the regular, burglary and kidnapping situations. This isn't anything unique with wrench attacks. But one thing that we noticed and was a bit, which alarmed us, and it was we were just a bit curious, is that in all 3 domestic economic abuse situations, the tool was always spiking. So you'd have a person who is an intimate partner spike their partner's drink or their parents' drink or their kids' drink. And while the person is drugged, they would just take their phone and transfer all their cryptocurrencies to another account, which is a bit disturbing, to be honest. And from the tools and methods, we go into the demands. So now we have this person in your room and in your flat holding a gun against you, and there's something that they want. So what is it that they wanted? So in most cases, they just didn't care. They just wanted cryptocurrencies, for you to just transfer anything that you have. In some cases, though, they wanted the means of access, like your private keys or the storing device. So there was this one victim we had interviewed, and they were basically kidnapped and put and chained in a basement. And all the attackers wanted was their ledger or their hardware wallet. The attacker knew that this victim had all their bitcoins in the wallet, so they specifically asked for the wallet only and the keys, of course. And finally, a bit funny enough, some attackers were a bit picky. So they didn't want the altcoins of the victims, they just wanted Bitcoin. So they would ask the victim, do not send me Ethereum, do not send me Doge, anything else, I just want Bitcoin. And in only a few cases, they weren't specified. So this is in terms of the demands. When it comes to the crime outcome, we care to see were these successful or were they failed attempts. Unfortunately, the majority of cases were successful, and 29 cases out of 105 were failed attempts. Some of them were for very hilarious reasons, but mostly were for legit reasons. For instance, if there was one case where robbers were in a house and the neighbor happened to hear and called the police, and the police came just in time. So for this reason, the attack didn't end up successful. Or in another case, particularly in the case where I gave earlier as an example, where the person was kidnapped and chained in the basement, the person gave out their wallet, but the attackers didn't know that the victim had multiple other wallets where they had distributed their wealth. So they only ended up with very little amounts, and they didn't care to check at the time. So that's on them. So in this case, they didn't end up getting the millions.
Marilyne,
Yes.
I mean, in terms of these statistics,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to suggest one thing or another, but then a lot of people, they may have cryptocurrencies like bitcoins for
Yeah.
various reasons. Some of them are probably criminal themselves.
Yeah.
Use that because the way they obtain the bitcoins, maybe by defrauding others, the victim example that you use,
Yeah.
or could be, they are using that for, for money laundering purposes. So, I mean, when they being subject to that kind of range attack, I mean, do they normally report? I mean, that's why, because your analysis is based on sort of, reported cases to the law enforcement agencies, but
Yeah.
how many of them were reported, but it did take place?
Yeah. So your first part of the question is the fact that if criminals themselves were being victimized by other ranch attackers, I don't think we had anything like that. Maybe one or two cases, I'm not too sure because we did the data collection 2 years ago. But I would just assume this is similar to any type of other crimes that you as an expert and a lawyer also know. Usually, if you're a criminal and you have something stolen from you, you don't go and report and complain to the police that, oh, this watch that I stole, someone came and stole it from me, right? So I would assume that's usually the case. But yes, but when it comes to the reporting of other types of crimes, when it comes to reporting other ranch attacks, so we actually have asked some of the interviewees about this. So we had 11 reported incidents in the interviews that we conducted, and only 2 incidents out of these 11 were reported to law enforcement. And one of the interviewees actually, when asked into what their experience was, they just said that from the start it was ignored. The police didn't take them seriously. But to be fair here, this incident was few years ago. I just know that in the past year or so, especially some law enforcement agencies like the Met are taking this very seriously and putting a lot of effort into this. But still, like we could still see that many of the attacks might go underreported, especially when it comes to, for instance, blackmail or threatening, or when you have sensitive issues there, or when you have domestic violence involved. Usually when it comes to crime types that are less reported and that are happening in wrench attack forms as well. I hope I answered your question there. Yeah. All right. Okay. So when we wonder why into these victims aren't reporting these incidents, as I mentioned, to add some explanation into this. So we noticed that they didn't think the police can do anything, as I mentioned. Some just didn't trust the police, and mostly they were just fearing to be re-victimized because, you know, a lot of people who in many type of crimes who are victimized, they often get re-victimized. So they just worried that by reporting and going on record, their attacker might know and attack them again. And others had security risk issues, so they just didn't want their name to be on a system where that it can be infiltrated, or, you know, they just didn't want to go public and be on record. And finally, they just didn't want to be outed as an owner, so they would rather lose some money instead of being recognized publicly as a cryptocurrency owner. Now, this is in cases where people are just, you know, not famous people or influencers, but rather just private holders. Okay. So, what can be done here to, you know, we are talking about this doomsday attack, and make, you know, our intention isn't to spread fear. So there are certain things that can be done to minimize someone being targeted, or if they are targeted, to minimize their losses. So first, the key is to have a combination of physical and digital security measures. So when it comes to users, for instance, the basic thing is to avoid bragging how much you have. For example, if you are in a pub, don't publicly say that, oh, I invested and won this much from this, you know, random meme coin or thing, because we have a victim who was doing that and they got just mugged in the pub while doing so. And second, just have your funds distributed across multiple wallets. This would just basically minimize and avoid you having to lose everything at once. Third, have some physical safety measures. For example, like Joseph, you were saying that you often travel and go into meetings and post on LinkedIn. It would be wise to post about these things after they happen. Because if someone's monitoring you, for instance, and they see that, oh, you're attending this conference, they might locate you there. So it would be better to post about where you were right after the conference has ended. And fourth, we have digital safety. This is basic security hygiene. Don't share your passwords with your friends, or at least have some passwords. Have 2FA and other measures. And finally, because 25% of the attacks happened in person, it's better to have due diligence when you have to buy or sell in person. For instance, take someone with you when you're going, or pick a safe place and time, like during the day in a very public place. Like you could go and meet up near the police station, where, you know, it would minimize someone, the chances of someone doing anything, because you're right in front of the station. And when it comes to also other types of approaches and what can be done, regulators also play an important role here. So one problem that we have identified and we are working on is the know your customer policies. So it is very important that regulators reconsider know your customer policies. For those who don't know your customer policies, or KYC verification, is a process that is implemented by the banking system and now with exchanges, where you provide a lot of personal information about you just for them to verify that this person is really you. So with exchanges, now that they are conducting KYC verification, there's evidence that they have weak security measures, which don't safeguard this data properly. So they end up creating a security and a rank attack risk for users. Now we have explained some of this risk in our paper from a few years ago. Feel free to check it out. But yes, what we need to do is push exchanges and custodians to implement better security if the regulators do not want to reconsider KYC verification, because as we know, regulators love anti-money laundering policies, so I don't think they're gonna remove them anytime soon. So the alternative solution is at least to have better security from that end. And finally, we have some recommendations for cryptocurrency service providers, and especially for wallet service providers. These are basically some system design changes. For example, with wallet software, it would be good to have dummy wallets. Like I know many of people who have fake physical wallets with them. So if someone asks you for your wallet, you give them like the fake wallet, which has like 20 pounds in it or something, instead of just giving out your main one, which has your ID and cards. This is similar in this situation as well. There are also other recommendations like changing the interface design. So for example, here on the right, you could see, and banks also are guilty of this. So once you immediately open your banking app or your exchange app, everything you own is displayed in bolded and big in big fonts. So if you have someone who is shoulder surfing, they could see how much you have, and that could turn you into a possible victim. So this is something basic that can be very helpful to consider. And this brings me to our key takeaways. So basically, cryptocurrency rank attacks are on the rise and everyone can be victimized. Second, we have offenders who are going back to conventional methods of committing crime to target emerging technologies. In this case, it's cryptocurrencies. This comes across as the new trend in cyber physical systems and risks. And third, we have the fact that harms surpass financial losses. So compared to fraud, where you have emotional losses or emotional damage a bit, and financial losses, in this case, you have physical damage as well. And finally, as I mentioned, users need a combination of physical and cybersecurity safety measures to protect against rank attacks. And this brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening. And if you are interested in reading the paper, you can find it here. Or if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyne. It's very interesting, thought-provoking, and but also let us know that what we need to do if how we should protect ourselves if we are somehow as stakeholders in this field. For example, academics, or say for example if you are also involved in crypto digital asset transactions. So this is the Q&A time. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, your virtual hand, and then we will unmute you. But before you ask, when you ask a question, please do let us know who you are and your institution, your affiliated institution, please. Thank you. Any question? Otherwise, there is one question in the chat, Marilyne. Sarah is asking, did all these interviewees, they will all get attacked in the same country? Because sometimes, if there's a lack of trust in the police system, then they don't report. And especially if the country bans cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. So you don't want to report to the police because you may be put yourself in you may be questioned by the police by why are you owning this cryptocurrency. So yeah, I think one thing is the trust in the police, and also whether that particular country also bans the owning or transacting cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, thank you for that question. No, actually, it wasn't a case where they were from one country. We tried to diversify. Actually, as I mentioned with interviews, it was very difficult to find people who were victimized. And after finding them, it was the convincing part. I had multiple people who, on the day, even though we had reassured them and provided them with all the protocols of security and ethics that we will follow, they just, were scared and just apologized and didn't want to continue with the interview. But we made sure that we had a diverse participants in terms of location. So we had multiple people from Europe, a few from the States or South America. We had a couple of people from North Africa and the Middle East. So it wasn't just a case of one country or one location.
Well, I have another one. Okay. Well, Sarah, thanks. I have another question. So, because Bitcoins, they are transacted on the blockchain, and blockchain is, we know, a couple of features of blockchains. You know, it's transparent and it's immutable. So assuming that if the attackers, they successfully obtain the Bitcoins and then they dissipate the coins from one account to another, it should be theoretically quite easy to trace how the money or how the Bitcoin is being dissipated. And shouldn't that be easier for the law enforcement agency to trace the Bitcoins and also to trace the attackers? And I mean, that's question one. Shouldn't it be easier for the law enforcement agency to catch them rather than, say, for example, rich attackers attack victims to obtain cash? And secondly, wouldn't it be, from a policy viewpoint, be advisable if the stolen Bitcoins can be reversed? For example, if that was a stolen Bitcoins, then that should be paid back, to the original accounts. That should be easier to manage than, say, for example, cash transactions.
Okay, I'm going to start with the second question. So the reverse part, it's basically what you're saying, something similar to getting reimbursed or something, right? And
Yes.
this can, of course, I think in multiple cases were happening, provided that the person was caught and found guilty after trial, right? So they get reimbursed and also get compensation for their losses or the emotional or physical damages or anything. If it's a house, if they had broken into it. So that's obviously going to happen, again, provided that they are found guilty after proper trial and everything. And in the first question, you asked if it should be considered easier to identify people who are stealing or getting cryptocurrencies, right? So in theory, yes. In theory, yes. But we have multiple problems that prevent that happening every time. So in few cases, this is already happening. But first of all, this takes a lot of effort and technical understanding from the law enforcement side. So while this can happen in places like the UK or the States, in other countries, law enforcement just don't have the intelligence or the skill set to do this, unfortunately, not yet. And the second part that hinders this is that most criminals, or many of them, will use mixers to anonymize or to, basically um, for the trace, because you can't trace the history and the wallets, right? So they could use either anonymizing coins like Monero, or they could use mixers in order to obscure that tracing process, which makes it more difficult, if not currently impossible, for them to be traced. So that's something that's very commonly happening, which can prevent from them being caught.
Okay, I think there's another question from Grace and from Yokohama National University. The question is, how do you think stakeholders should modify or enhance the KYC process in light of the wrench attack, given that it is considered a cornerstone of money laundering legislation aimed at protecting users?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for asking it, Grace. So one thing, as I mentioned, it's because regulators are not going to, leave or abandon KYC processes or AML policies. Now, the core problem here is that we had identified is the fact that regulators took what was applying in the classical financial system with banks and other service providers, and they took it as is and without tailoring to the needs and the specification of the technology. They applied it as is on exchanges who aren't as ripe or experienced compared to the existing financial system. So they aren't experienced enough to handle something like this. So it's either to have these regulations more tailored in terms of the needs and what the industry can do, because compliance is very expensive. You have SMEs or entrepreneurs or early starters will not afford fancy lawyers and compliance in order for them to do this. So you would either have smaller companies leaving the regulated markets, or you will have them shut down or operate illegally. So you need to take into consideration what the market is. Otherwise, an easier route would be to have these exchanges have more proper security measures. So if you're still going to oblige them to collect all this data, at least have them have proper security in order for them to secure it and prevent them from being stolen. I hope I answered the question there.
Okay, so if there's no other questions, I would like to close this session to an end. And thank you, Marilyne, for this
Thank you.
very interesting talk. And thank you for all of you here to participate in this webinar. And if you have further questions, and I hope that you had opportunity to get Marilyne's email so you can contact her directly. And we will continue holding our webinar series in this semester. So do keep an eye on our posts in this event, and I do hope that to see you at our next webinar event. And thank you very much, and then have a nice afternoon or evening
Thank you
or
very much,
morning, depending on
Joseph.
where you are. Thank you, Marilyne, and
And
thank
thank you,
you,
everyone.
everyone. Yeah. Goodbye.